Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another installment of Bring On the Bad Guys, the show where we look at the supervillains from throughout comic book history. Today we are looking at the villains that fought Ant-Man, aka Hank Pym, aka Giant Man, and the Wasp in the 1960s. In order to qualify for this list, these villains had to have appeared against Pym and the Wasp in Tales to Astonish in the 60s. And Ant-Man actually did not have his own self-titled comic in the 60s. Neither did the Wasp. So all of their stories from the 60s were collected in the Tales to Astonish magazine, which is also where Hank Pym and Ant-Man, they're the same person, but they had different first appearances. And they are both in Tales to Astonish. So you're going to see a lot of astonishing things here. There's going to be one character that's probably going to surprise quite a few viewers. There's a clue as to who that might be on screen right now. So take a quick gander, see if you can guess. If you can't, you'll find out eventually. So without further ado, let's move on to number 10. And number 10 is the Living Eraser. Classic name. Real name of Kutza, and he first appeared in Tales to Astonish number 49 in November of 1963. And of course, he comes from a planet with a super cool name, Thaloom, from Dimension Z. He was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. The power scale, which we review very quickly right here: personality, powers, mythology, design, and cultural impact. 5 categories, each worth 5 points. And each character is graded in those 5 categories, and the higher their score, the more legendary / nefarious the villain is. Most of the categories are self-explanatory, but mythology stands for anything that happens in the comic book pages, while cultural impact is video games, movies, TV shows, anything off those pages that happens to have this character in it. So the Living Eraser will snag a 2 in personality, 2 in powers, 2 in mythology, and 2 in design. Decent design, mythology, very limited, not a whole lot of appearances. Powers, we'll get to his powers in a sec, but nothing really that scary or intimidating. Personality 2, his personality really wasn't fleshed out that much in the pages of the comics, even to this point. Cultural impact 1, meaning he has never actually appeared anywhere off the pages of the comics. So the Living Eraser from Dimension Z actually doesn't erase people. He has technology that makes it look like he is erasing people. He's actually just teleporting them to his home dimension. And he first came into conflict with Hank. Actually, it was the first time Hank Pym appeared as Giant Man. So he's also one of the first villains that utilized interdimensional travel specifically to a dimension that occupies the same place as our own. So there's a lot of sci-fi, comic book, fiction, or is it fiction, that plays with the theory that there are several universes or dimensions, and they're just kind of on different vibrational frequencies. And this is one of the first villains to really do that in the Marvel universe. So he first fought Hank and Jan, so Ant-Man and the Wasp, or Giant Man and the Wasp, I should say, when he began to kidnap scientists from the Earth so that he could bring them back to his world and have them work on technology to make him weapons for his kingdom. And unfortunately, he fell victim to the classic "tell my entire plan to my nemesis" blunder, and Ant-Man and the Wasp managed to make their way into his dimension, where they were successful in getting the scientists back to our dimension. And that was really all they had to do. They consigned the eraser to his own dimension. He would come back. He fought the Thing later on, She-Hulk, Morbius, the living vampire. Not really a whole lot of big stories with the Living Eraser involved, however. So we move on to number 9, the Scarlet Beetle. And, you know, a comic book company like Marvel, they have Spider-Man, they have Ant-Man, they have Scarlet Spider, they have the Beetle. you'd think that if there was a villain that exists that was named Scarlet Beetle, it would be somebody dressed up like a red beetle, right? No, that's not actually the case. The Scarlet Beetle is actually a beetle. That's Scarlet. So, he doesn't have a real name. He's just a Scarlet Beetle, and he first appeared in Tales to Astonish number 39 in January of 1963. His place of origin as his humble beetle self, New York City, New York, and he was created by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Larry Lieber. His power scale, personality 2, which is pretty high for a beetle, actually. Powers 2, mythology 1. He doesn't appear in a lot of stories, as you can probably imagine. Design 3, I just think he looks cool. The scarlet color. And I think beetles look generally pretty cool anyway. So he gets a 3 for design. Cultural impact 1. Nothing off the pages of the comic books for the Scarlet Beetle. So an interesting thing about the beetle is that he first attacked Ant-Man when he was beetle size. So he gained telepathic powers through, what else? Exposure to atomic radiation, and had started collecting armies of insects, arachnids, all sorts of bugs and crawly creatures. And he sent all those creatures after some Pym particles. And the Pym particle is the scientific method that Ant-Man and the Wasp use to change size. So the Scarlet Beetle's minions were able to abscond with a Pym particle or two, bring them back to their leader, and the Scarlet Beetle then grew himself up to human size, actually slightly bigger than human size. And as a human-sized beetle, he possessed, superhuman strength, and he also had a genius-level intellect, which was a result of the atomic radiation. Who knew that radiation made you smart? And he also, of course, possessed, limited telepathy in that he could communicate with other insects, bugs, creatures like that, except, of course, ants. Ants remained on the side of the good guys and loyal to Ant-Man. And it was the ants and Ant-Man versus the Scarlet Beetle and a ton of other bugs, a menagerie of insects, as you will. And the ants won the day, were able to get the Scarlet Beetle back down to normal size and scrubbed free of all the radiation that had given him his superpowers. So that is the Scarlet Beetle. I personally would think it would be hilarious to see the Scarlet Beetle in the next Ant-Man and Wasp movie, but I'm not holding my breath, unfortunately. Speaking of breath, number 8 is The Voice. I know those aren't exactly related, but hey, I had to make that jump somehow. The Voice, Jason Sprague is his real name. He first appeared in Tales to Astonish, number 42, in April of 1963. He originally hails from Gary, Indiana, in the US of A, and was created by Stan Lee, Larry Lieber, and Don Heck. His power scale, he's our third villain at 9 overall, which does indicate the level of villainy in this top 10 list. Personality 2. He was radio host. We'll get into that in a little bit. Not a lot of Ant-Man's villains were very charismatic in the 60s, so not a high score there. Powers 2. So his powers, you might call them vocal persuasion. He was exposed to, again, what a surprise, atomic particles, and they caused a mutation in his vocal cords. And in rather the same way as, let's say, Kilgrave from the Jessica Jones TV show and the comics, he then got the ability to persuade people to do whatever he said. And that can be quite a pain in a superhero's back, neck, thorax, depending on if it's an ant or a human being. So mythology is also a 2. Not a lot of wonderful stories with the voice of Doom in it, but he does have some interesting go-arounds. Design 2, you don't see it here because he is actually dressed like a normal human being, more or less, with the top hat, but he had a pretty ridiculous looking blue and yellow outfit with a V on the front, and he also from time to time wears speakers on top of his shoulders to broadcast his voice longer distances, which just kind of looks tacky. So Design 2, Cultural Impact 1, yet another villain who has not appeared off the pages of the comic books. So Sprague's story is that he was a radio broadcaster in Indiana, discovered that he had this power of persuasion, and as you can probably imagine, it was really good for advertising because he could just tell the people that were listening to his radio station to basically buy whatever he wanted or whatever he wanted people to buy. And the radio station enjoyed that quite a bit, but as villains are wont to do, he decided that his pay at the radio station was not good enough and decided, I'm going to go be a criminal, which he did. For whatever reason, he decided that the first step in establishing himself as a criminal mastermind was to discredit Ant-Man, turn the country, or at least the city of New York, against him. He failed quite miserably and was turned away on his diabolical quest by Ant-Man and his, of course, insect allies. Later on, he showed up and battled the West Coast Avengers, which were kind of known for their bizarre villains and occasionally bizarre heroes. And he worked with a supervillain group called the Skeleton Crew. That's Jason Sprague, the voice. Number 7, we have our second alien, but first monstrous alien, Pillai. And Pillai first appeared in Tales to Astonish number 44 in June of 1963. And he's also known as the creature from Cosmos, because that's the dimension that he is from. He was created by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and H.E. Huntley. His personality, he does not have a very great personality. He is a giant alien being that decides that he pretty much likes killing and absorbing things. Not high on the list of people that you want to be friends with. Powers 3, he is quite formidable as he is a telepath. He can secrete formic acid and create seismic waves. He also has a malleable form, so that means he can kind of shapeshift in the sense that he can change shape, not really mimic people. And his mythology is a 3, and that is really what boosts him on this list because he actually is responsible for a very iconic situation. Maybe iconic might be the wrong word, very influential situation. We'll get to that in his origin story. His design is at a 1. He is basically a giant blob with eyes and sometimes tentacles, and he has said as much. They're more of a fluid, liquid form of life on his planet, so he doesn't really have a set shape. And as a result, just looks like a big, ugly blob. And Cultural Impact 2, he has not appeared off the pages of the comic books. He only gets a slight bump because of his backstory, which in turn influenced other characters off the comic book pages. And that backstory is this. So, way back before Ant-Man and the Wasp became crime-fighting partners, Vernon Van Dyne, so that's the Wasp's dad. Janet is the Wasp's actual name, Janet Van Dyne. So Vernon Van Dyne was a scientist, and he accidentally transported Pillai from his dimension to our own and to New York City. Pillai actually went on to say, guess what? You got my dimension's greatest criminal, now I'm on Earth, and I'm going to do my thing here. He killed Vernon Van Dyne and jumped out of the lab, or oozed out of the lab, and went on to menace New York. Janet Van Dyne returns home. She had been introduced to Hank Pym earlier. She decides he's really the only superhero I know. She runs to him, tries to get his help, and over the course of Hank's investigations, found out that Peli secreted formic acid, and Pym developed a formula that counteracted that and basically zapped Peli's power, and then they worked on sending him back to his own dimension. Hasn't really done a whole lot since then, but a very influential moment, as if he had not killed Vernon Van Dyne, Jan would have never went to Hank for help, and she may not have ever become the Wasp. So, influential decision by Peli, even though it didn't turn out the best for him. Moving to number 6, the Hijacker, real name of Howard Mitchell. And he first appeared in Tales to Astonish 40 in February of 1963. His place of origin is the good old New York City of New York. And he was created by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Larry Lieber. Personality lands at a 3. He was a little more fun to be around, a little more wily than some of his predecessors on the list. Powers 2. Most of his powers, well, no, all of his powers, really, aside from being a smart engineer, resided in his suit/armor. He actually might have a decent time fighting against COVID-19 because he had set his helmet up so that it contained a certain amount of oxygen that he felt he would need during the course of some of his criminal campaigns. And the reason he did that is because he didn't want to risk superheroes interfering and maybe using knockout gas or something like that. So he had his own oxygen supply within his suit while he was off doing criminal things. So he may be able to withstand the coronavirus if he was a real person. Mythology 2, not a lot of really famous stories with the Hijacker. He's maybe more well known for being killed by Venom in more recent days, as Venom was in his anti-hero lethal protector type mode. Design is a 3, and his helmet has been drawn in some kooky ways, but it has come out looking pretty cool at sometimes, and the gold/bronze and purple color scheme is kind of fun. So he gets a 3 for design. Cultural impact is a 1 because, like everyone else here, hasn't really shown up past the comic book pages. So, Hijacker's origin, he wasn't satisfied really with what he was doing, and he was running a armored truck company. And he decided he wanted to start collecting insurance payment and also absconding with the things that he was transporting, such as lots of money. So he decided to steal his own company's vehicles, aka hijack them, which is how he got his name. And he used his suit and sleeping gas. Again, that's where his helmet and mask came in handy, where he didn't have to breathe anything. And hijacked the trucks, kept the money, collected the insurance money. Police investigated, and Howard wanted to be absolutely sure that he was above suspicion, so he decided to ask Ant-Man for help. And as every Agatha Christie fan knows, when you ask an investigator or detective for help because you're trying to throw suspicion off of yourself, the detective usually finds out what's going on. So, didn't work out for Howard. Ant-Man won. And later on would, once he got out of jail, be recruited by a number of supervillains because they enjoyed having him at their disposal due to his technical expertise. The Hood is a more recent villain that worked with the Hijacker, for example. Number 5, it's the Porcupine, another intimidating creature. Just like a Scarlet Beetle, right? His real name, Alexander Gentry. His first appearance, Tales to Astonish 48 from October of 1963. His place of origin, also New York City, New York. Stan Lee and Don Heck were his creators. And his personality is a 3. Very impetuous, very quick-minded and quick-handed. And doesn't really put up with a lot of garbage from people. So quick to act, quick to punch Sandman in the face, which is actually what he's doing in this picture here, and quick to develop new sorts of weapons that he can use against superheroes to advance his own personal vendettas. Powers 2, so he's an expert in designing weapons, but all his weapons are usually in his battle suit, which is his Porcupine design, and not, he doesn't have any superhuman powers. Mythology 2, he's generally has some good stories in the pages of Ant-Man comics, but not a lot of influence in the greater Marvel universe. Design 2, I'm not going to put up the picture now because it's almost too ugly, but the Porcupine's first suit of armor is one of the ugliest comic costumes of the early days. However, it got a lot cooler. The spines were less clunky and they looked less like wooden straws, and everything became a little more refined. Still spiky, but refined. So, got better. Cultural impact is also a 2. And it would be a 1, but again, his costume is actually kind of famous for being pretty ugly. So, he actually gets another point there for a total of 11. So, Mr. Gentry actually worked for the U.S. Army at first as a weapons developer, and he developed the Porcupine outfit, which was very clunky, but the quills were all weaponized in one way or another. So some of them would shoot, which we know that porcupines actually can't do. They cannot shoot their quills, but this porcupine could. Different poison gases, knockout gas, projectile weapons, lasers. He outfitted the outfit. That's a mouthful. Outfitted the outfit with all these weapons, and usually each individual quill that he had access to that he had weaponized would be a different sort of weapon. And the army didn't really go with his weapon. Could have been because it looked like a walking haystack, but nevertheless, it was actually a pretty effective weapon. He was one of the first villains to actually have relative success against Ant-Man and the Wasp, because he had all these weapons, he had this armor, he was very well prepared, he was not an idiot, as some villains are, and his first confrontation with Ant-Man and the Wasp resulted in a victory on his part, and of course later Hank and Jan were able to figure things out a bit more and find a way to stop him, which they did. And he was recruited later on, just like a lot of these people, by the Secret Empire, by the Magia, usually to act as a combination muscle and brain. So he could design weapons, he could also fight using his armored porcupine suit. And he's not a bad fighter either. So pretty good ally to have if you are a villain, especially since he has improved the look of his costume. Now we come to number 4, which is the surprise, and that's Krag Lun. And Krag Lun, a.k.a. Krag Lun from Guardians of the Galaxy, Volume 1 and 2. And just a quick fade back here to the third Funko Pop here. That's Krag Lun with Yondu's Mohawk / arrow controller. And pretty surprising to see him show up on this list, and his role was pretty minor. I used pretty twice because it is very minor. And his real name is Krag Lun Obfanteri, some sort of alien lingo last name. And he first appeared in Tales to Astonish number 46 in August of 1963. His place of origin is a planet called A Chiltar 3. So you know it's a ways out there when it's named 3 of something, when it's an alien planet. And his creators were Stanley Ernest Hart and Don Heck. Personality 3, and really if we didn't know what would happen to Krag Lun in the future, he wouldn't get some of these higher scores. But at first, he really was nothing more than I don't want to say lackey, a soldier that was part of a force that was sent to invade Earth. Later on, he would develop a better personality because of his appearance in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. Powers 2. So he has a good mastery of alien weaponry. He can operate a weaponized suit. He has multifaceted eyes. And he's an above-average military tactician and space pilot. So decent powers, but not anything beyond what is typical for someone of his rank and his race. Mythology is 1, so he showed up as one of a small force of soldiers from his planet to try to infiltrate the planet Earth. And they actually used a giant robot that looked like a Cyclops, so like mythological Greco-Roman Cyclops, and Ant-Man figured out what the deal was with that. It wasn't actually a Cyclops, it was a robot. And Krag Lun and his fellow soldiers were found out and run off the planet. After that, he didn't really show up until the Guardians of the Galaxy movies came out within the last 10 years, where he was kind of updated a little bit, given more of a humanoid look. It was kind of retconned that the aliens with Krag Lun in the first story were in suits of armor, and as a mix you have a kind of blue, kind of furry, long-eared Krag Lun, whereas in the movies he looks just like a human. So design 3, and his design at first in the robot-looking suit was decent, nothing wrong with it, nothing spectacular, and as we moved later on, he was outfitted with Ravager wear, and the multifaceted eyes are kind of a cool look. So he gets bumped up to a 3. Cultural impact is a 4 because of the character's presence in the 2 Guardians of the Galaxy movies, especially the second one where he plays a bigger role. And of course, he's played by Sean Gunn. And yeah, his appearances in the movie really bumped him up on this list. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't be on it, because we would be definitely looking at lower scores for personality and cultural impact. So Krag Lun, saved by the MCU as our 4th to the top villain. Now we move to number 3, another one with a familiar name, although it might not be the person you're quite as familiar with, and that is the Black Knight. So this is actually the second Black Knight in Marvel Comics, the first villainous one. His name is Nathan Garrett, and he first appeared in Tales to Astonish number 52 in February of 1964. His place of origin is good old London, England, and he was created by Stan Lee and Dick Ayers. And that sounded kind of weird when I said Dick Ayers, so let's not stick with that. So Dick Ayers is his creator along with Stan Lee. Power scale, personality 2. It's kind of a rotten criminal that didn't have a lot of ambition beyond getting a bunch of money and being able to sit back and relax and retire on giant stacks of cash. Powers 2. So very, very, very smart person. Genius level intellect as far as genetics go. He was an electrical engineer as well. But as far as powers go, he has a flying horse, which is always a great asset, and a weaponized lance. So nothing super human about his powers. His mythology is a 3, and that has more to do with what he set down for the future. His nephew became the 3rd Black Knight and joined the Avengers, and that Black Knight is going to show up in the MCU next year in Eternals, and of course was an Avenger for many years. Design is a 2. His suit of armor is pretty cool. His helmet looks really clunky and bumps a 3 down to a 2. Cultural impact 4, mostly because he gave the Black Knight armor, again, to his relative to become the heroic Black Knight. And the Black Knight actually has a pretty notable history in the Marvel Universe. The first Black Knight was Sir Percy of Scandia, and his first appearance was way back in the 50s when Marvel was still Atlas Comics. He had his own series. It only lasted a handful of issues. And Garrett is the descendant of Percy. And he fought Ant-Man both before and after he turned into a costume villain. And Garrett was originally just robbing banks. Then he found his... I'm looking for the word that's the opposite of descendant. His ancestor, there it is, his ancestor's Black Knight armor and weaponry, and went on a crime spree with it. Of course, he kind of had a little bit of a conversion before he passed away and passed on the helm, literally, of the Black Knight to his nephew, who is a superhero. So Garrett has actually served on the Masters of Evil and was one of the initial members, the charter members, and he was also tasked by Doctor Doom to help eliminate the Fantastic Four. So he had some missions of note before he hung up his spurs. I think he still wears spurs, if you have a flying horse, probably. He has appeared as the Black Knight in 2 animated shows, the Marvel Superheroes show from the 60s and Iron Man Armored Adventures from more recent times. And he was in 2 of Marvel's Lego games, Avengers and Marvel Superheroes 2. He is actually a playable character in Avengers. He's a DLC character. Actually, he's a playable character in both of them. He's got actually a whole castle to fall back on in Marvel Superheroes 2, as that is one of the places throughout time and space that Kang the Conqueror yanks into his own time-spanning world. And we get to see both the heroic and the villainous Black Knight in that game. Number 2, we have Egghead, which is definitely something you don't want to be called even if you're a villain. His real name is Elias Starr, and he first appeared in Tales to Astonish 38 way back in December of 1962. And like others on this list, his place of origin is the Big Apple, New York City. He was created by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Larry Lieber. His personality sits at a 3, and when people look at Egghead, they can think, discount Lex Luthor, crabby, but he actually is quite persuasive when he needs to be. He doesn't quite have the patience of, say, someone like the Puppet Master, who may have his minions and may act okay towards them. Egghead doesn't have time for people that he thinks are stupider than him, so he's very cold to anyone who he thinks has a lesser intellect. That means even the people that he has hired out to work for him. So he may be a negative, he may have very negative opinions, but that doesn't mean that he is a complete failure at having his own personality. It's just a very acute personality. Powers 2, not really any superhuman powers, just a very, very, very incredible capacity to really learn any new subject and process that, genius level intellect here we're talking. So in turn, he develops weapons, plans, schemes, and usually tries them out against Ant-Man. So they're kind of rivals in the scientific world as well as in the heroic/villain world, because they both have scientific experiments they want to put forward and prove that they are smarter each than the other. Oh, excuse me. So Egghead was actually responsible. Well, let's not jump forward. Let's do the rest of this power scale here. 3, mythology. Middle of the road, especially for an arch-villain, where he has appeared against Ant-Man, against the Avengers, against other heroes, but not really in a nefarious, high-level manner. Design 2, the suit is decent enough, but, he's called Egghead for a reason. He looks like he has an egg for a head. And cultural impact 4. And the cultural impact shows up because he has actually appeared in the MCU very briefly. He is played by Michael Cerveris in Ant-Man and the Wasp. He has a very short cameo, a flashback cameo, that explains the origin of Ghost, who is one of the main villains in that movie. He has also showed up as an antagonist in the animated film Avengers Confidential, Black Widow, and Punisher. And he's been in the Superhero Squad show, The Avengers United They Stand, Avengers Assemble. He is also an unlockable character in the Lego Avengers game, where, of course, you can throw eggs at people, which is classic. And he's probably best known for being responsible for the death of Hawkeye's brother, Barney Barton. And he also, one of his more interesting stories in his early days is he teamed up with the Puppet Master and the Mad Thinker, who of course are primarily Fantastic Four villains, and they were able to actually pull off some blackmail against the actual U.S. government. And of course, the government relied on Ant-Man and friends to come to the bottom of, or to get to the bottom of that scheme and bring Egghead to justice. Finally, last but not least, we have Whirlwind. Whirlwind is actually David Cannon, and he first appeared in Tales to Astonish number 50 in December of 1963. Also from the Midwest, he was from Kansas City, Missouri, originally, and he was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. His personality sits at a 3. Again, middle-of-the-road villain, nothing too great, nothing too ungreat. He was clever enough to pose as the Wasp's chauffeur for a significant amount of time in his early days, and you have to have a decent mental capacity and personality to pull something like that off, while also being a supervillain. Powers 3. Whirlwind, as you might guess, means he can spin really fast. He has added a lot of weaponized metal to his costume. So Ninja Star looking things, lots of blades on his wrists and helmet, and at some points he even has what look like circular saw blades mounted to his wrists so that they can also spin and cause some more damage. He's actually a mutant. He's one of the few mutants that first appeared in the 60s that was not an X-Men character originally. Of course, since then he has fought against the X-Men from time to time, but he first called himself the Human Top and went to rob jewelry stores. Of course, Ant-Man and the Wasp repeatedly put a halt to his schemes. Design 2, he has had some really kind of weird armors throughout the year. They make him almost look like the Juggernaut from the X-Men, but green, and you can't see his face at all. There's like little metal slits in the metal that allow him to see, but don't allow anything to really get through. More recent costumes have been a little bit better, but still kind of clunky looking. Cultural impact would be a 4. And that is because even though he has not appeared in the MCU yet, that might be because he's a mutant. I'm not quite sure how that lined up with the X-Men/mutant rights as far as Fox having the rights to the X-Men and mutant characters, or if Whirlwind was enough of an Avengers villain and character, kind of like Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, that he would have been included in the Avengers stable. But regardless, everyone's back with the MCU now from Fox, so hopefully we will see him down the road. He has also appeared in the Iron Man animated show, Avengers United They Stand, Superhero Squad show, Ultimate Spider-Man, Avengers Assemble, Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, so he's definitely tops on this list in terms of getting out there as far as the most shows And also video games, he was a boss villain in Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2, and before that, Captain America and the Avengers. And he's also a playable character in the Masters of Evil downloadable content for Lego Avengers. And an antagonist, of course, that you have to defeat first before you can unlock the character to play. And back when his, again, he debuted as the Human Top, robbed jewelry stores, Ant-Man and the Wasp brought him down. Then he wisely chose Whirlwind as his new secret identity name and got rid of calling himself the Human Top. Got a job as the Wasp's chauffeur so he could keep an eye on both the Wasp and Ant-Man and figure out where they were focusing, what they were thinking. And he was planning to eventually steal from Janet, steal part of, because Janet is a very rich individual, and he was planning on robbing a significant portion of her riches, which didn't really pan out for him. He joined up with the Masters of Evil at one point, the Lethal Legion, Thunderbolts. He's also worked for the Red Skull, Count Nefaria, the Mandarin. So he's been around the block quite a few times as a pretty easy villain for other villains to hire and bring on board for their schemes and evil endeavors. And that's David Cannon. That's Whirlwind. Going over them again. Living Eraser at 10. At 9, Scarlet Beetle. At 8, The Voice. 7, Ply, the creature from Cosmos. 6, The Hijacker. 5, The Porcupine. 4, Krag Lun. 3, The Black Knight. 2, Egghead. And, of course, number 1, Whirlwind. So, that is, I should say, those are your Ant-Man villains from the 60s, Ant-Man and the Wasp. Next week, we are going to take a short break from, how do you say this? Arch nemesis type villains, and look at some of the monster villains from Marvel's early days and the Atlas days. So that's what we are going to do with our next series. Or our next show, I should say. But thanks for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe to Daventry Studios, who brings you this show, Bring on the Bad Guys, and keep a lookout for some new programming, hopefully coming your way within the next few weeks to month, something like that. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and have a good one.